The ballroom of Harrogate House blazed with the light of 500 candles, their flames trembling in the warm draughts that stirred the silk gowns of 100 dancing couples. Eleanor Vane stood at the edge of the floor, her gloved fingers wrapped around a glass of lemonade she had not tasted for an hour. Her gown was the color of forget-me-nots, a foolish choice she had made 3 days earlier with a heart full of foolish hope. Now the blue felt like a bruise. She was watching him. She was always watching him. Alexander Montcrief, the Duke of Ashworth, stood near the marble pillars with his friend Lord Hargrave, his dark head inclined slightly as he listened to some remark. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably tailored in midnight black superfine, and everything about him radiated the quiet, unassailable authority of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Eleanor had loved him from the first moment she had seen him at Almack's 2 seasons ago, when he had glanced at her without truly seeing her, and she had felt her entire world tilt on its axis. She knew it was hopeless. She was the daughter of a baronet, her family respectable but painfully pinched, her dowry a thin whisper of what the Duke of Ashworth might command. She was not a great beauty. She was too quiet, too bookish, too prone to lingering in corners and watching rather than speaking. But she had believed, with the ferocious innocence of a girl who had never been hurt, that perhaps he might notice her if she simply remained present, remained patient, remained devoted. She moved a little closer, threading through the crowd, not consciously stalking him but drifting on the current of her own desperate longing. She was perhaps 10 feet away when Lord Hargrave spoke, and the Duke's reply cut through the music and the laughter with the clarity of a bell tolling. "Good God, Ashworth, that little blue wren has been circling you all evening. Miss Vane, is it not? Does she ever blink? It is becoming rather tragic." The Duke lifted his glass of champagne and examined the bubbles with a weary sigh. "Miss Vane, the sparrow who lives in corners. I assure you, Hargrave, I have done nothing to encourage her. She simply hovers. It is a minor irritant like a draft one cannot quite locate. One learns to ignore it." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. Her heart stopped, then restarted as a painful, lurching thing. For one stretched, crystalline moment she could not move. She could not breathe. The floor beneath her slippers seemed to tilt, threatening to pitch her into the whirl of dancers. The Duke had not raised his voice. He had not even looked at her. He had dismissed her with the casual cruelty of a man flicking dust from his sleeve. She stood frozen, the lemonade glass trembling in her hand, and in that silence she saw herself as he saw her. A hovering sparrow, a minor irritant, a pathetic little shadow trailing after a man who did not even respect her enough to speak of her with common decency. Lord Hargrave laughed. "Brutal Ashworth, the poor girl." "The truth often is." The Duke set down his glass. "Now, if you will excuse me, I believe Lady Harriet is waiting for the next waltz. At least she has the virtue of being diverting." They moved away. Eleanor remained rooted to the spot, the hum of conversation rushing back into her ears like water into a drowning woman's lungs. Her face burned. Her eyes stung. She could feel the jagged edges of her shattered pride cutting her from the inside. She set the lemonade down on a passing tray with a hand that was remarkably steady. She did not weep. She did not flee. She walked slowly, deliberately through the archway into the corridor, past the liveried footmen, down the great staircase, into the cold night air of the portico. Only when she was alone, with the stars scattered overhead like shards of broken glass, did she press her gloved hand to her mouth and let the first silent sob tear through her. She had been a fool, an utter, blind, devoted fool. She had given 2 years of quiet, steadfast adoration to a man who thought of her as a draft. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. But even as the tears slipped down her cheeks and froze in the winter air, something else began to stir beneath the pain. Something hard and clear and cold. She would never, ever be spoken of that way again. She would not be a sparrow. She would not hover. She would tear out the part of herself that had loved him, root and branch, and she would plant something stronger in its place. She lifted her chin, wiped her eyes with the back of her glove, and turned to walk toward her family's hired carriage. The wheels crunched over gravel as she climbed inside, and she did not look back at the blazing windows of Harrogate House. Not once. She did not know that, in the ballroom above, the Duke of Ashworth had paused mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the empty space where the little blue figure had always stood. Something was missing. He could not say what. He shook off the sensation and offered his arm to Lady Harriet, but the feeling lingered, an unfamiliar thread of unease winding through his chest, and it refused to be shaken away. 3 weeks passed before the Duke of Ashworth saw Eleanor Vane again, and when he did, he almost did not recognize her. The occasion was a dinner party at the Marquis of Chelford's townhouse, a gathering of 40 of the season's most fashionable members. Alexander attended out of obligation, not pleasure. The social whirl had become a dull repetition of the same faces, the same gossip, the same simpering debutantes whose eyes followed him with that familiar, hungry light. He had grown so accustomed to being watched that he had stopped noticing it at all. Until he stopped noticing her. It was the absence that snagged his attention first, a tiny gap in the fabric of his expectations. The Vane girl, Miss Vane, was always present at these events, always somewhere on the periphery, a quiet splash of pale color in his side vision. He had not consciously catalogued her, but his mind had somehow filed her there, a piece of the scenery that belonged. Tonight he could not find her anywhere. Then he did, and the shock of it made him pause in the middle of a sentence to Lady Chelford. Eleanor Vane stood by the fireplace in the drawing-room before dinner, and she was not dressed in forget-me-not blue. Her gown was deep forest green, a rich velvet that caught the firelight and turned her complexion from merely pale to luminous. Her dark hair, usually arranged in some demure and unremarkable style, had been swept up with a simplicity that was almost severe, exposing the elegant line of her throat. She wore no jewels, no fussing lace. She held a glass of sherry, and she was speaking to Mr. Theodore Whitmore, a young gentleman with a kind face and a respectable inheritance, and she was laughing. Alexander realized with a slow, creeping astonishment that he had never seen her laugh before. He had never seen her smile, not truly. He had only ever seen her looking at him with those wide, earnest eyes, an expression that had once irritated him, and now, in its sudden and complete absence, left him strangely off balance. He excused himself from Lady Chelford and moved through the room, not toward Eleanor, simply in her direction, as if magnetically drawn. He told himself he was merely curious. He had dismissed her so thoroughly in his mind that seeing her transformed was a puzzle, nothing more. He positioned himself near a cluster of gentlemen some 10 feet away, and eavesdropped without shame. "And the translation was simply marvelous, Miss Vane," Mr. Whitmore was saying, his face animated. "I confess I had always found Dante rather forbidding until you explained the political context. You have a gift for making the obscure feel immediate." Eleanor smiled, a warm, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You are very kind, Mr. Whitmore, but I think Dante does the work himself if one is willing to meet him halfway. The Inferno is not merely a journey through hell. It is a journey through regret. I find that far more compelling than the fire and brimstone." Alexander blinked. She read Dante. In Italian, apparently. The sparrow who lived in corners had an intellect, and she wielded it with an easy grace that made Mr. Whitmore lean closer, utterly captivated. A strange, hot sensation prickled at the back of Alexander's neck. He did not know what to name it. Irritation, perhaps. He had been misinformed. That was all. Dinner was announced, and to Alexander's further astonishment, he found that Eleanor had been seated not near him, not even within his line of sight, but at the far end of the table beside an elderly viscount who was clearly enthralled by whatever she was saying. Alexander watched her over the rim of his wine glass. His meal growing cold on his plate, she did not glance his way, not once. She did not seek him out with her eyes, did not pause in her conversations to see if he was watching her. She existed entirely independently of him, and it was the most unsettling thing he had experienced in recent memory. After dinner, the guests gathered in the music room. Lady Harriet took to the pianoforte, and several young ladies prepared to sing. Alexander saw his opportunity and approached Alina, who stood near the window, her hand resting on the curtain as she gazed out at the moonlit garden. "Miss Vane," he said, his voice pitched low, "I did not have the opportunity to greet you earlier. I trust you are well." She turned and her eyes met his without flinching. They were not the wide, adoring eyes he remembered. They were calm, courteous, and utterly unreadable. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head with perfect politeness. "I am quite well, thank you. I hope you have been enjoying the evening." "I have," he said, and then paused, uncharacteristically at a loss. "I do not recall seeing you at the Harringtons' ball last week." "No," she agreed. "I was otherwise engaged." She did not elaborate. She did not simper. She simply stood there, as serene and self-contained as a marble statue, waiting for him to either speak or excuse himself. He felt a prickle of something that was almost anger. He was a duke. She was a baronet's daughter. She should be grateful for his notice. Instead, she was looking at him as if he were a pleasant but unremarkable acquaintance, and he found that he did not care for it at all. "You seem changed, Miss Vane," he said, and there was an edge to his tone he had not intended. Her lips curved, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "Do I? Perhaps you simply never saw me clearly, Your Grace. The light in a ballroom can be deceptive." She curtsied, a perfect, graceful movement, and then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the window with the uncomfortable sensation that he had just been subtly and expertly dismissed. He watched her cross the room to rejoin Mr. Whitmore, who welcomed her with a warmth that made Alexander's jaw tighten. The hot, prickling sensation had spread from his neck to his chest. He identified it now, with a reluctant and irritated certainty. It was the sting of being ignored. And he did not like it. He did not like it at all. The spring thaw brought an invitation to a house party at Thornfield Abbey, the country seat of the Earl of Dunsmore, and Alexander accepted with an eagerness that surprised even himself. He told his valet it was the hunting he missed. The truth was a far more complicated thing, one he was not yet willing to examine. He had seen Alina Vane only twice since the Chelford dinner, both times at large gatherings where she had treated him with the same distant, courteous indifference. Each encounter had left him more unsettled than the last. She was a puzzle he could not solve, a melody whose notes had rearranged themselves into a song he did not recognize. And he, who had never chased a woman in his life, found himself unable to stop thinking about her. Thornfield Abbey sprawled across a gentle rise in the Derbyshire countryside, its gray stone walls softened by ivy and the pale green of new leaves. The first afternoon, the guests assembled on the terrace for tea, and Alexander's eyes found Alina immediately. She was standing beside a trellis of climbing roses, her head tilted as she listened to the elderly Countess of Dunsmore describe the garden's history. She wore a sprigged muslin dress the color of lavender, and her hair was looser than usual, a few dark curls brushing her cheek in the warm breeze. She looked entirely at ease, entirely herself, and entirely oblivious to his presence. He spent the afternoon in a state of mounting frustration. He attempted to position himself near her during the garden walk, but she was constantly surrounded by other guests, Mr. Whitmore, the young Lady Anne, a scholarly vicar who seemed to share her passion for Dante. She laughed and talked and moved through the gathering with a natural, unforced grace that drew people to her like moths to a flame. She was no longer the Sparrow. She was a bright, burning candle, and everyone wanted to stand in her light. Everyone except him, it seemed. The turning point came the following morning. The party had organized a riding expedition through the estate's bridle paths, and Alexander, an excellent horseman, found himself riding alongside Alina quite by accident, or so he told himself. Her mount was a spirited bay mare, and she handled the animal with a quiet competence that impressed him despite himself. "You ride well, Miss Vane," he said, steering his gelding closer. She glanced at him, her expression neutral. "Thank you, Your Grace. I have always found horses to be excellent company. They do not dissemble." He felt the small barb beneath the words, but he could not tell if it was intended for him or merely a general observation. "A rare quality in any creature," he agreed. "I have often thought the same." She said nothing, simply guided her mare around a fallen branch, and they rode in silence for a few moments. The dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy above, painting shifting patterns on her lavender habit. Alexander found himself staring at the curve of her gloved hand on the reins, the steady confidence of her posture. "I have been meaning to ask you," he said, his voice more abrupt than he intended, "about your translation of Dante. Mr. Whitmore mentioned it at the Chelford dinner. I was unaware you spoke Italian." Alina looked at him then, truly looked, and there was a flicker of surprise in her dark eyes. "There are many things you were unaware of, Your Grace. I speak 4 languages. I have read extensively in philosophy and natural history, and I can name every constellation visible in the English sky. I simply never had reason to share any of that with you." The words were not spoken with malice. They were spoken with a calm, factual clarity that was somehow worse than any accusation. She was not angry. She was not hurt. She was simply stating the truth of his own ignorance, and the weight of it settled on his chest like a stone. He opened his mouth to reply, to offer some defense, but before he could speak, a rabbit burst from the undergrowth and startled her mare. The horse shied violently, and Alina, caught off guard, slipped sideways in the saddle. Alexander's arm shot out, his hand closing around her waist, steadying her before she could fall. The contact was brief, mere seconds, but the feel of her slender form beneath his palm, the warmth of her body through the layers of wool and linen, sent a shock through him that was entirely physical and entirely unwelcome. She righted herself, her cheeks flushed, and pulled her mare to a halt. "Thank you," she said, slightly breathless. "That was careless of me." "Not at all," he managed, his voice rougher than he wished. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly." She smoothed her skirt and nudged her horse forward, and he saw that the cool composure had returned, but not before he had glimpsed something else in her expression, a fleeting vulnerability, quickly suppressed. They rode on, and the conversation shifted to safer ground, the beauty of the countryside, the plans for the evening's entertainments. But Alexander could not forget the feel of her waist beneath his hand, the rapid flutter of her pulse against his fingertips. He had touched dozens of women in the course of dances and polite greetings, and never had his body reacted with such undignified immediacy. That evening at dinner, he watched her from across the table as she conversed with the scholarly vicar about the stars. She spoke of Orion and Cassiopeia, of the myths that wove through the constellations, and her face was animated with a quiet, genuine passion that made his chest ache in a way he did not understand. Mr. Whitmore was seated beside her, and he leaned close to murmur something that made her laugh. The sound was bright and unguarded, and Alexander felt a surge of something dark and possessive rise in his throat. Jealousy. He recognized it now, and the recognition was a cold, unwelcome shock. He was jealous of a country gentleman with a modest fortune and a pleasant smile. He, the Duke of Ashworth, was burning with envy because a woman he had dismissed as a minor irritant was laughing at another man's jest. He set down his wine glass with more force than necessary, drawing a curious glance from the Countess. He forced a smile and turned to engage her in conversation, but his mind remained fixed on the far end of the table, on the woman who had once followed him with her eyes and now refused to look at him at all. Something had to change. He did not yet know what he intended to do, but he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he could not bear this indifference a moment longer. The ball at Thornfield Abbey was the culmination of the house party, and the great hall had been transformed into a fairyland of candlelight and hothouse flowers. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above, and the guests drifted in like a tide of silk and jewels, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. Alexander arrived early and positioned himself near the entrance, a deliberate choice he did not care to examine too closely. He wanted to see her arrive. He wanted to watch her walk through those doors, and he needed, to be the first thing she saw. When Alina appeared, his breath caught in his throat. She was wearing a gown of deep amber silk, the color of aged whiskey caught in firelight, and it clung to her slender figure in a way that was entirely modest yet devastatingly alluring. Tiny gold pins glittered in her dark hair, and her throat was bare, pale, elegant. She paused in the doorway for a moment, her gaze sweeping the room, and when it passed over him without stopping, he felt the cold lash of her indifference like a whip across his skin. He moved toward her anyway, cutting through the crowd with the determination of a man who had finally admitted defeat in a battle he had not known he was fighting. "Miss Vane," he said, bowing, "might I have the honor of the first waltz?" She looked at him, and for a long, suspended heartbeat he thought she would refuse. Her dark eyes were unreadable, her posture perfectly composed. Then she inclined her head, a gesture so slight it might have been an illusion. "If you wish, Your Grace." He offered his arm, and she laid her gloved fingers on his sleeve with a lightness that was almost nothing, a ghost of a touch. He led her to the floor, and as the orchestra struck up the waltz, he took her in his arms with a care that surprised him. She was so slight, so fragile-seeming, and yet the steel in her spine was unmistakable. They danced. She moved with him perfectly, her steps flawless, her body responsive to every subtle shift of his weight. But she did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed somewhere over his shoulder, a distant and polite remove. "You are angry with me," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Her eyes flickered to his briefly. "I am not angry, Your Grace. I am nothing at all to you. You made that quite clear." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. "I do not know what you mean." "No," she said, and her voice was soft, almost sad. "I do not suppose you do. You said something once at a ball at Harrowgate House. You were speaking to Lord Hargrave. You called me a minor irritant, a draught one learns to ignore, a sparrow who lives in corners." The blood drained from his face. He remembered that conversation. He remembered the weary, dismissive tone he had used, the casual cruelty of a man who had never considered that his words might have consequences. He remembered, and the shame crashed over him in a sickening wave. "Miss Vane," he began, his voice strangled. "Do not trouble yourself," she interrupted, and now her gaze met his fully, steady and clear. "I am not telling you this to extract an apology. I am telling you so that you understand why I will not be your Sparrow any longer. I heard you that night. I heard every word, and I decided in that moment that I would never again allow any man to think of me as a creature to be tolerated, not even a duke." The waltz ended. She stepped back from him, her hand slipping from his shoulder, and she curtsied with perfect, icy grace. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace. It was most instructive." She turned and walked away, and he stood frozen on the dance floor, the other couples swirling around him like leaves caught in a current. He watched her cross the room to where Mr. Whitmore was waiting, and he saw the way the young man's face lit up at her approach. He saw her take Whitmore's arm, saw her smile at him, a real smile, warm and unguarded, and something inside Alexander cracked, a fissure that ran straight through the bedrock of his pride. He had called her a sparrow, and she had become a phoenix, rising from the ashes of his cruelty, and now she was poised to fly straight into the arms of another man. The thought was unbearable, unacceptable. He spent the rest of the evening in a haze of desperate calculation. He danced with other women, made polite conversation, went through the motions of a gracious guest, but his eyes followed Alina everywhere. He watched her waltz with Whitmore, watched her laugh at the vicar's stories, watched her take a turn about the room with the elderly Earl of Dunsmore. She did not look at him once, not once. And when the ball ended and the guests began to disperse, Alexander found himself standing alone on the terrace, staring up at the indifferent stars. The night air was cold, but the chill that settled in his bones came from within. He had destroyed something without even knowing he was doing it, and now he did not know if it could ever be rebuilt. He only knew that he had to try. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in strategic pursuit, though Alexander would not have called it that. He called it making amends. He called it righting a wrong. He did not call it what it truly was, a man slowly, inexorably falling in love with a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. He began with the small things. He sent a parcel of books to her family's modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, a rare edition of Dante's Commedia with annotations in the original Italian, a collection of astronomical charts, a slim volume of poetry by a new voice he had discovered in a shop in Piccadilly. There was no note, only his card with a simple inscription, "For a scholar who deserves better libraries than I can offer." Her response came 3 days later in the form of a polite, formal thank you letter that might have been penned by a secretary. She appreciated the gesture. She hoped he was well. There was no warmth in the words, no opening for further correspondence. He read the letter 4 times, searching for hidden meaning, and found nothing but civility. Undeterred, he attended a lecture at the Royal Society on the Transit of Venus, knowing from the scholarly vicar that Alina would be present. He arrived early and took a seat at the back, and when she entered the hall with her mother and a female cousin, he watched her scan the room and noted the precise moment she saw him. Her expression flickered, surprise, perhaps, or wariness, and then smoothed into that familiar, neutral mask. She chose a seat on the opposite side of the hall. He approached her during the interval, threading through the crowd with the determination of a man storming a fortress. "Miss Vane," he said, bowing, "I did not expect to find you here." "Nor I you, your grace." Her tone was pleasant, disinterested. "Are you a student of astronomy?" "I am a student of many things I once neglected," he replied, holding her gaze. "I find I have a great deal of catching up to do." She held his look for a beat longer than was comfortable, and he saw something shift in her dark eyes, a tiny crack in the wall she had built. Then she blinked, and the wall was solid again. "I am sure you will find it a rewarding endeavor. Now, if you will excuse me, I promised my cousin I would fetch her a glass of lemonade." She slipped away, and he let her go because he had seen the crack. It was small, but it was there. It was hope. The real breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon in May, in the library of Lady Ashford's townhouse. He had accepted the invitation to her literary salon solely because he knew Alina would be there. And when the gathering broke into smaller groups for tea, he maneuvered himself into the corner where she sat alone with a volume of Blake. "May I join you?" he asked. She looked up, and he saw the flicker of something, resignation, perhaps, or reluctant amusement. "This is a library, your grace. The chairs do not belong to me." He sat. The rain beat against the tall windows, a steady, soothing rhythm that seemed to cocoon them in their own private world. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a proper one, not the one I stumbled through at Thornfield. Will you hear it?" Alina closed the book in her lap and regarded him with an expression he could not quite read. "I will hear it, but I will not be moved by it. I hope you understand that." "I understand," he said, and the words were raw in his throat. "I was cruel and careless. I spoke of you in a way that was beneath the dignity of any man, let alone a gentleman. I did not know you were listening, but that does not excuse it." It was the remark of a fool who was too comfortable in his own arrogance to see the worth of what was in front of him. "I am sorry, Miss Vane, truly, deeply sorry." She was silent for a long moment. The rain drummed on the glass. Somewhere in the next room a woman laughed. Then Alina said, her voice very quiet, "Do you know why it hurts so much, your grace? It was not because you insulted me. It was because I had loved you. For 2 years I had loved you with the whole of my foolish, inexperienced heart, and to hear you speak of me as if I were a nuisance, a piece of furniture that had become inconvenient, it broke something in me. It broke my faith in my own judgment. I did not think I could ever trust myself again. Her words hung in the air between them, devastating in their honesty. Alexander felt his throat tighten. He had known, on some level, that her devotion had been more than mere admiration, but to hear her say it, to hear the past tense had loved, was a wound he had not prepared himself for. "I did not know," he whispered. "No," she agreed. "You did not see me, you never saw me." She paused and her voice steadied. "But I see myself now. I am not that girl anymore. I will not be defined by a man's opinion, even yours." Alexander leaned back, his heart pounding. "I do not deserve your forgiveness." "No," she said, and for the first time that afternoon, a ghost of a true smile touched her lips. "You do not. But I am giving it to you anyway because I am tired of carrying the weight of it. I forgive you, your grace, not for your sake but for mine." He stared at her, this woman who had transformed her pain into quiet, unassailable strength, and he felt the ground shift beneath him. The admiration he had been nursing for weeks crystallized into something deeper, something perilous and profound. He wanted her. Not just her attention, not just her forgiveness. He wanted her, all of her mind and her heart and her stubborn, blazing spirit. "What can I do," he said, his voice rough, "to earn the right to know the woman you have become?" Alina looked at him for a long time. The rain began to ease, the gray light softening through the windows. Then she said simply, "You can be patient, you can be honest, and you can stop calling me Miss Vane. My name is Alina." "Alina," he repeated, and the sound of it on his lips was a prayer. She rose, gathering her book and her shawl. "I will see you at the Claringtons' dinner next week, your grace. Do not be late." She left him there in the quiet library, the rain fatting to a gentle drizzle, and Alexander Moncrief, the Duke of Ashworth, sat motionless in his chair and realized that he had just fallen irrevocably in love. The Claringtons' dinner was a glittering affair, but Alina moved through it with a strange, suspended sense of unreality. The Duke had been as good as his word. He was patient, he was honest, and he was present. He sought her out with a quiet persistence that never quite crossed the line into pressure. He brought her books. He asked her opinions on politics and poetry and the stars. He looked at her as if she were the only woman in every room they shared. And she, despite every resolution, felt the walls she had built beginning to crumble. It terrified her. She had remade herself from the ashes of humiliation, had learned to stand on her own 2 feet without the crutch of his approval. To let him back in felt like a betrayal of all that hard-won independence. And yet, when he looked at her with those gray eyes, when he said her name in that low, careful voice, she felt the dangerous stirring of the old, foolish hope. Then the rumors began. She heard it first from her cousin Harriet, who had heard it from Lady Jersey's maid, who had it on excellent authority that the Duke of Ashworth was on the verge of announcing his engagement to Lady Mary Cranford, an heiress whose fortune rivaled that of minor royalty. Lady Mary was beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly suited to be a duchess. The match, everyone agreed, was as good as settled. Alina received the news with a composure that surprised even herself. She thanked Harriet for the information, excused herself to the withdrawing room and sat down on a velvet settee in the empty room and pressed her hand to her chest, where a dull, familiar ache had begun to spread. She had been a fool, again. He had apologized, yes. He had been kind, yes, but kindness was not love. A man in his position married for fortune and connection, not for the quiet affection of a baronet's daughter with a thin dowry and a taste for Dante. She had let herself hope. She had let herself believe that his attention meant something more than idle curiosity. And now the truth had arrived, as it always did, to remind her of her place. She did not weep. She had done her weeping 2 years ago in the cold night air of Harrowgate House. She simply sat very still, breathing slowly, and allowed the pain to settle into its familiar shape. Then she rose, straightened her gown, and returned to the dinner party with her head held high. The Duke approached her after the meal, his brow furrowed with concern. "Elena, you look pale. Are you unwell?" "I am perfectly well, Your Grace," she said, her voice cool and distant. "I understand congratulations are in order. I wish you every happiness with Lady Mary." His face went blank with shock. "What are you talking about?" "The engagement," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice remained. "It is all over London. I am surprised you did not mention it yourself, but I suppose these things are negotiated in private. I am sure Lady Mary will make a splendid Duchess." Alexander stared at her, and she saw the color drain from his face, leaving him pale beneath his tan. "There is no engagement," he said, his voice low and intense. "There is no understanding, no negotiation, no arrangement of any kind between myself and Lady Mary Cranford. I have met the woman exactly twice, and on both occasions I found her perfectly pleasant and entirely uninteresting. Who told you this?" "It does not matter who told me," Elena replied, though her heart had begun to pound erratically against her ribs. "The rumor exists, and rumors of this magnitude do not arise from nothing. They arise from ambitious mothers and bored gossips," he said fiercely. "Elena, you must believe me. I am not engaged. I am not courting anyone. The only woman I have courted in any sense of the word is standing in front of me right now." She wanted to believe him. The desperate sincerity in his eyes was almost enough to undo her, but she had been deceived by hope before, and the scars were still tender. "Your Grace, I cannot do this. I cannot be the woman who waits in the wings while the Tun speculates about your marital prospects. I have spent too long learning to value myself to become a footnote in someone else's story." He reached for her hand, and the touch of his fingers sent a shiver through her entire body. "Then be the center of mine. Marry me, Elena. Not because of rumor or obligation or anything other than this. I love you. I have loved you for months, and I will love you for the rest of my life. Please, I am begging you, do not walk away from me now." The words hung in the air, and for one wild, breathless moment, Elena felt the world tilt toward joy. Then the practical part of her mind reasserted itself. "You are a duke," she whispered. "I am nobody. Your family, your peers, they will never accept me." "My family will accept whoever makes me happy," he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "And my peers can go to the devil. I do not care about any of it. I only care about you." She looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had once dismissed her and now burned with an intensity that stole her breath, and she felt the walls inside her tremble. But she could not say yes. Not yet. Not until she was sure that she was choosing him freely, not out of fear or desperation or the lingering ghost of the girl she used to be. "I need time," she said, withdrawing her hand from his grasp. "I need to think. Please, Alexander, give me that." He nodded, though the pain in his expression was unmistakable. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I will wait. I will wait for as long as it takes." She left him standing alone in the Claringtons' drawing-room, and as she climbed into her carriage and the horses clattered off into the London night, she pressed her fingers to her lips and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to cry. The days that followed were the longest of Alexander's life. He honored his word and gave her space, though every fiber of his being screamed at him to go to her, to plead his case, to do something, anything, to bridge the distance she had placed between them. He threw himself into his duties, attended Parliament, met with his stewards, wrote letters of business with a mechanical precision that left his secretaries bewildered. But his mind was never on the work. His mind was always on her. He learned, through discreet inquiry, that she had gone to her family's small country estate in Surrey, a modest house surrounded by beech woods and quiet fields. He learned that Mr. Whitmore had called on her there twice. The knowledge was a slow poison, eating away at his composure. He did not blame Whitmore. The man was decent and honorable and clearly smitten. But the thought of Elena accepting another man's suit, of her bright laughter being directed at someone else for the rest of her life, was enough to drive him to the brink of madness. A week passed, then another. He received no word from her. He wrote her a single letter, brief and restrained, expressing his hope that she was well and his enduring affection. She did not reply. On the 14th day, he broke. He ordered his horse saddled and rode from his London townhouse to Surrey in a single, punishing journey, arriving at the gates of the Vane estate as the sun was sinking behind the beech trees in a blaze of orange and gold. He was dusty, exhausted, and entirely indifferent to propriety. He dismounted, tossed the reins to a startled groom, and strode up the gravel path to the modest front door. A maid answered his knock, her eyes widening at the sight of a duke on the doorstep. "I am here to see Miss Vane," he said, and his voice brooked no argument. "Please inform her that the Duke of Ashworth requests the honor of a moment of her time." The maid scurried away, and Alexander stood in the fading light, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door opened again, and Alina stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a simple gown of pale gray muslin, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts surprise and resignation. "You did not write," she said. "You did not answer my letter," he replied. A small, tired smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "No, I did not." She paused, and then she stepped aside and gestured toward the garden path. "Walk with me." They walked in silence through the tangled, overgrown garden, past borders of lavender and rosemary, until they reached a stone bench beneath an ancient oak. She sat, and he sat beside her, and for a moment they simply looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to emerge. "I have been thinking," Alina said at last, her voice soft and reflective, "about the girl I was, about the woman I have become, about what I want and what I deserve." Alexander's throat was dry. "And what have you concluded?" She turned to face him, and her eyes, dark and luminous in the twilight, held his without flinching. "I concluded that I love you. I have loved you for longer than I care to admit, and I suspect I will love you for the rest of my life, no matter what choices I make. But I also concluded that love is not enough. I need to know that you see me, truly see me as your equal, not as a sparrow, not as a draft, as a woman with a mind and a will and a life of her own." "I do," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "Alina, I swear to you I see you. You are the most intelligent, the most courageous, the most extraordinary person I have ever known. I was blind before, but I am not blind now. I will spend every day of my life proving that to you if you will let me." She was silent for a long moment, and the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken possibility. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool and steady in his grasp. "I am not a duke's daughter," she said. "I have no fortune, no grand connections. The tongue will talk. They will say you have married beneath you." "Let them talk," he said. "I have endured their gossip my entire life. It has never brought me an hour of happiness. You, Alina, you have brought me more joy in the past months than I knew I was capable of feeling. I do not care what anyone says. I only care about you." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she did not brush it away. "I was so angry with you for so long," she whispered. "And then I was angry with myself for not being able to stop loving you. But I think I have finally made peace with it, with you, with us." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the question. She laughed, a wet, trembling sound, and nodded. "Yes, it is a yes, on one condition." "Anything?" "You must promise me that you will never, ever call me a sparrow again." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "I promise. You are not a sparrow, you are a phoenix, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget it." She leaned into him then, her head resting against his shoulder, and they sat together beneath the ancient oak as the stars bloomed overhead, and the night wrapped around them like a benediction. The wedding took place on a golden morning in early September, in the small stone church of the village near Thornfield Abbey. The Earl of Dunsmore, who had grown fond of Alina during the house party, had offered his estate for the occasion, and she had accepted with a quiet gratitude that touched him deeply. The church was filled not with the glittering multitude of the ton, but with those who truly mattered. Aliner's family, a few close friends, the scholarly vicar who had promised to lend her his astronomical charts, and Mr. Whitmore, who had taken the news of her engagement with a grace that Alexander could not help but admire. The young man had even offered his congratulations, and Alexander had shaken his hand with genuine respect. Alina walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and Alexander felt his breath leave his body in a rush. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant, with a veil of antique lace that had belonged to her grandmother. Her dark hair was wound with tiny white rosebuds, and her face was radiant with a happiness that transformed her from merely beautiful into incandescent. She walked with the steady, grounded grace of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she deserved. When she reached the altar and took his hand, her fingers were steady in his. He looked down at her, this woman who had turned her pain into strength and her humiliation into triumph, and he felt a surge of love so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, the ancient words wrapping around them like a cloak of promise. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alexander lifted her veil and kissed her with a tenderness that drew a collective sigh from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward was held on the lawns of Thornfield Abbey, beneath tents of white muslin that billowed in the warm breeze. There was music and dancing and laughter, and Alina moved through it all with a joyful ease that made Alexander's heart ache with gratitude. She danced with her father, with the earl, with the vicar, and even with Mr. Whitmore, who held her with a gentle respect that spoke of genuine affection. But when the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, she slipped away from the crowd and walked alone to the edge of the garden, where a trellis of climbing roses stood heavy with late blooms. Alexander followed her, as he would always follow her, drawn by an invisible thread that had been woven between them over the long, painful, beautiful months. She turned as he approached, and the setting sun caught her face and turned her eyes to gold. "I was just thinking," she said, "about the night of the Harrogate ball. I stood outside in the cold and I thought my heart would never heal. I thought I would carry that humiliation with me forever." "And now?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me," she said quietly. "If I had not overheard you that night, I might have remained a sparrow forever. I might never have found the courage to become myself. So in a strange way, I am grateful for the pain. It led me here." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed each one in turn. "I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that you gave me a second chance. I did not deserve it." "No," she agreed, her eyes sparkling with gentle mischief. "You did not, but love is not about deserving, it is about choosing. And I choose you, Alexander Moncrief, today and every day." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his cheek pressed to her hair, breathing in the scent of roses and sunshine and the ineffable sweetness of her. The music drifted from the tents, a soft waltz, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the dusky sky. "Alina," he murmured into her hair, "my phoenix, my love, my Duchess." She lifted her head and kissed him. A kiss that tasted of promise and forgiveness, and the quiet, enduring joy of two people who had fought their way through fire and emerged, together, on the other side. And behind them the roses bloomed, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the world, for this one perfect moment, was exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.